The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia began its retreat from Gettysburg on July 4, 1863. Following General Robert E. Lee's failure to defeat the Union Army at the Battle of Gettysburg, he ordered a retreat through Maryland and over the Potomac River to relative safety in Virginia. The Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by Gen. George G. Meade, was unable to maneuver quickly enough to launch a significant attack on the Confederates, who crossed the river on the night of July 13–14. Confederate supplies and thousands of wounded men proceeded over South Mountain through Cashtown in a wagon train that extended for 15 to 20 miles, enduring harsh weather, treacherous roads, and enemy cavalry raids. The bulk of Lee's infantry departed through Fairfield and through the Monterey Pass toward Hagerstown, Maryland. Reaching the Potomac, they found that rising waters and destroyed pontoon bridges prevented their immediate crossing. Erecting substantial defensive works, they awaited the arrival of the Union Army, which had been pursuing over a longer roads more to the south of Lee's route, before Meade could perform adequate reconnaissance and attack the Confederate fortifications. Lee's army escaped across fords on a hastily rebuilt bridge. Combat operations, primarily cavalry battles, raids, and skirmishes, occurred during the retreat at Fairfield, Monterey Pass, Smithsburg, Hagerstown, Boonesboro, Funkstown, and around Williamsport and Falling Waters. Additional clashes after the armies crossed the Potomac occurred at Shepherdstown and Manassas Gap in Virginia, ending the Gettysburg Campaign of June and July 1863. Background: military situation. The culmination of the three-day Battle of Gettysburg was the massive infantry assault known as Pickett's Charge, in which the Confederate attack against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge was repulsed with significant losses. The Confederates returned to the positions on Cemetery Ridge and prepared to receive a counterattack. When the Union attack had not occurred by the evening of July 4, Lee realized that he could accomplish nothing more in his Gettysburg campaign and that he had to return his battered army to Virginia. His ability to supply his army by living off the Pennsylvania countryside was now significantly reduced, and the Union could easily bring up additional reinforcements as time passed, whereas he could not. Brig. Gen. William N. Pendleton, Lee's artillery chief, reported to him that all of his long-range artillery ammunition had been expended and there were no early prospects for resupply. However, despite casualties of over 20,000 officers and men, including a number of senior officers, the morale of Lee's army remained high and the respect for the commanding general was not diminished by the reverses. Lee began his preparations for retreat on the night of July 3, following a council of war with some of his subordinate commanders. He consolidated his lines by pulling Lt. Gen. Richard S. Ewell's 2nd Corps from the Culp's Hill area back through the town of Gettysburg and onto Oak Ridge and Seminary Ridge. His men constructed breastworks and rifle pits that extended 2.5 miles from the Mummersburg Road to the Emmetsburg Road. He decided to send his long train of wagons carrying equipment and supplies, which had been captured in great quantities throughout the campaign, to the rear as quickly as possible, in advance of the infantry. The wagon train included ambulances with his 8,000 wounded men who were fit to travel, as well as some of the key general officers who were severely wounded but too important to be abandoned. The great bulk of the Confederate wounded, over 6,800 men, remained behind to be treated in Union field hospitals and by a few of Lee's surgeons, selected to stay with them. There were two routes the Army could take over South South Mountain to the Cumberland Valley, from where it would march south to cross the Potomac at Williamsport, Maryland. The Chambersburg Pike, which passed through Cashtown in the direction of Chambersburg, and the shorter route through Fairfield and over Monterey Pass to Hagerstown. Fortunately for the Confederate Army, it now had its full complement of cavalry available for reconnaissance and screening activities, a capability it lacked earlier in the campaign while its commander, Marge, Gen. J.E.B. Stuart, was separated from the army with his 3 best cavalry brigades on Stuart's right. Unfortunately for the Confederate Army, however, once they reached the Potomac they would find it difficult to cross. Torrential rains that started on July 4 flooded the river at Williamsport, making fording impossible. 4 miles downstream at Falling Waters, Union cavalry dispatched from Harper's Ferry by Marge, Gen. William H. French destroyed Lee's lightly guarded pontoon bridge on July 4. The only way to cross the river was a small ferry at Williamsport. The Confederates could potentially be trapped, forced to defend themselves against Meade with their backs to the river. Opposing forces, the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, retained the general organizations with which they fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. By July 10, some of the Union battle losses had been replaced and Meade's army stood at about 80,000 men. The Confederates received no reinforcements during the campaign and had only about 50,000 men available. The Army of the Potomac had significant changes in general officer assignments because of its battle losses. Meade's Chief of Staff, Marge, Gen. Daniel Butterfield, was wounded on July 3 and was replaced on July 8 by Marge, Gen. Andrew A. Humphreys. Brig. Gen. Henry Price replaced Humphreys in command of his old division of the 3rd Corps. Marge, Gen. John F. Reynolds, killed on July 1, was replaced by Marge, Gen. John Newton of the 6th Corps. Marge, Gen. Winfield S. Hancock of the 2nd Corps, wounded on July 3, was replaced by Brig. Gen. William Hayes. Marge, Gen. William H. French, who had temporarily commanded the garrison at Harper's Ferry for most of the campaign, replaced the wounded Daniel Lee Sickles in command of the 3rd Corps on July 7. In addition to the battle losses, Meade's army was plagued by a condition that persisted during the war: the departure of men and regiments whose enlistments had expired, which took effect even in the midst of an active campaign. On the plus side, however, Meade had available temporary, although inexperienced, reinforcements of about 10,000 men who had been with General French at Maryland Heights, which were incorporated into the 1st Corps and 3rd Corps. The net effect of expiring enlistments and reinforcements added about 6,000 men to the Army of the Potomac, including the forces around Harper's Ferry, Maryland Heights, and the South Mountain passes. By July 14, between 11,000 and 12,000 men had been added the army, although Meade had extreme doubts about the combat effectiveness of these troops. In addition to the Army of the Potomac, Marge, Gen. Darius N. Couch of the Department of the Susquehanna had 7,600 men at Waynesboro, 11,000 at Chambersburg, and 6,700 at Mercersburg. These were emergency troops that were hastily raised during Lee's march into Pennsylvania and were subject to Meade's orders. In addition, a force of about 6,000 from the newly created Department of West Virginia under Brig. Gen. Benjamin Franklin Kelly sat astride the Baltimore and Amp, Ohio Railroad at Grafton and New Creek, to prevent Confederate forces from retreating west, as well as later assisting in the pursuit of Lee toward Virginia. Confederate Lee's Army of Northern Virginia retained its core organization and commanders, although a number of key subordinate generals were killed, captured, or severely wounded. Imboden's wagon train At 1 a.m. on July 4, Lee summoned to his headquarters Brig. Gen. John D. Imboden, one of Stuart's cavalry brigade commanders, to manage the passage of the majority of the trains to the rear. Imboden's command of 2,100 cavalrymen had not played much of a role in the campaign up until this time, and had not been selected by Stuart for his right around the Union Army. Lee and Stuart had a poor opinion of Imboden's brigade, considering it indifferently disciplined and inefficiently directed, but it was effective for assignments such as guard duty or fighting militia. Lee reinforced Imboden's single artillery battery with 5 additional batteries borrowed from his infantry corps and directed Stuart to assign the brigades of Brig. Gen. Fitzhugh Lee and Wade Hampton to protect the flanks and rear of Imboden's column. Imboden's orders were to depart Cashtown on the evening of July 4, turn south at Greenwood, avoiding Chambersburg, take the direct road to Williamsport to ford across the Potomac, and escort the train as far as Martinsburg. Then, Imboden's command would return to Hagerstown to guard the retreat route for the remainder of the army. Imboden's train consisted of hundreds of Conestoga-style wagons, which extended 15 to 20 miles along the narrow roads. Assembling these wagons into a marching column, arranging their escorts, loading supplies, and accounting for the wounded took until late afternoon on July 5. Imboden himself left Cashtown around 8 p.m. to join the head of his column. The journey was one of extreme misery, conducted during the torrential rains that began on July 4, in which the wounded men were forced to endure the weather and the rough roads in wagons without suspensions. Imboden's orders required that he not stop until he reached his destination, which meant that wagons breaking down were left behind. Some critically wounded men were left behind on the roadsides as well, hoping that local civilians would find and take care of them. The train was harassed throughout its march. At dawn on July 5, civilians in Greencastle ambushed the train with axes, attacking the wheels of the wagons until they were driven off. That afternoon at Cunningham's Crossroads, Captain Abram Jones led 200 troopers of the 1st New York Cavalry and 12th Pennsylvania Cavalry in attacking the column, capturing 134 wagons, 600 horses and mules, and 645 prisoners, about half of whom were wounded. These losses so angered Stuart that he demanded a court of inquiry to investigate. Fairfield and Monterey Pass. After dark on July 4, Hill's 3rd Corps headed out onto the Fairfield Road, followed by Lt. Gen. James Longstreet's 1st Corps and Richard S. Ewell's 2nd Corps. Lee accompanied Hill at the head of the column. He ordered Stuart to post Col. John R. Chambliss's and Brig. Gen. Albert G. Jenkins's brigades to cover his left rear from Emmetsburg. Departing in the dark, Lee had the advantage of getting several hours head start, and the route from the west side of the battlefield to Williamsport was about half as long as the ones available to the Army of the Potomac. Meade was reluctant to begin an immediate pursuit because he was unsure whether Lee intended to attack again, and his orders continued that he was required to protect the cities of Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Since Meade believed that the Confederates had well fortified the South Mountain passes, he decided he would pursue Lee on the east side of the mountains, conduct forced marches to quickly seize the passes west of Frederick, Maryland, and threaten Lee's left flank as he retreated up the Cumberland Valley. However, Meade's assumption was wrong. Fairfield was likely held by only 2 small cavalry brigades, and the passes over South Mountain were not fortified. If Meade had secured Fairfield, Lee's army would have been forced to either fight its way through Fairfield while its rear was exposed to the Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, or to take his entire army through the Cashtown Pass, a much more difficult route to Hagerstown. On July 3, while Pickett's charge was underway, the Union cavalry had a unique opportunity to impede Lee's eventual retreat. Brig. Gen. Wesley Merritt's brigade departed from Emmetsburg with orders from Cavalry Commander Marge. Gen. Alfred Pleasanton to strike the Confederate right and rear along Seminary Ridge. Reacting to a report from a local civilian that there was a Confederate forage train near Fairfield, Merritt dispatched about 400 men in 4 squadrons from the 6th U.S. Cavalry under Major Samuel H. Starr to seize the wagons. Before they were able to reach the wagons, the 7th Virginia Cavalry, leading a column under Confederate Brig. Gen. William E. Grumble Jones, intercepted the regulars, starting the minor Battle of Fairfield. Taking cover behind a post and rail fence, the U.S. cavalrymen opened fire and caused the Virginians to retreat. Jones sent in the 6th Virginia Cavalry, which successfully charged and swarmed over the Union troopers, wounding and capturing Starr. There were 242 Union casualties, primarily prisoners, and 44 casualties among the Confederates. Despite the relatively small scale of this action, its result was that the strategically important Fairfield Road to the South Mountain passes remained open. Early on July 4, Meade sent his cavalry to strike the enemy's rear in lines of communications so as to harass and annoy him as much as possible in his retreat. 8 of 9 cavalry brigades took to the field. Col. J. Irvin Gregg's brigade moved toward Cashtown via Hunterstown and the Mummersburg Road, but all of the others moved south of Gettysburg. Brig. Gen. John Buford's division went directly from Westminster to Frederick, where they were joined by Merritt's division on the night of July 5. Late on July 4, Meade held a council of war in which his corps commanders agreed that the army should remain at Gettysburg until Lee acted, and that the cavalry should pursue Lee in any retreat. Meade decided to have Brig. Gen. Governor K. Warren take a division from Marge. Gen. John Sedgewick's 6th Corps, the most lightly engaged of all the Union Corps at Gettysburg, to probe the Confederate line and determine Lee's intentions. Meade ordered Butterfield to prepare for a general movement of the army, which he organized into 3 wings, commanded by Sedgwick, Marge, Gen. Henry W. Slocum, and Marge, Gen. Olive Haro, Howard. By the morning of July 5, Meade learned of Lee's departure, but he hesitated to order a general pursuit until he had received the results of Warren's reconnaissance. The Battle of Monterey Pass began as Brig. Gen. Judson Kilpatrick's cavalry division arrived near Fairfield on July 4 just before dark. They easily brushed aside Brig. Gen. Beverly Robertson's pickets and encountered a detachment of 20 men from the Confederate 1st Maryland Cavalry Battalion, under Captain G.M. E. Mack, that was guarding the road to Monterey Pass, aided by a detachment of the 4th North Carolina Cavalry and a single cannon. The Marylanders delayed the advance of 4,500 Union cavalrymen until well after midnight. Kilpatrick was not able to see anything in the dark and considered his command to be in a perilous situation. He ordered Brig. Gen. George A. Custer to charge the Confederates with the 6th Michigan Cavalry, which broke the deadlock and allowed Kilpatrick's men to reach and attack the wagon train. They captured or destroyed numerous wagons and captured 1,360 prisoners, primarily wounded men in ambulances, and a large number of horses and mules. Following the fight at Monterey, Kilpatrick's division reached Smithsburg around 2 p.m. on July 5. Stuart arrived from over South Mountain with the brigades of Chambliss and Ferguson. A horse artillery duel ensued, causing some damage to the small town. Kilpatrick withdrew at dark to save my prisoners, animals, and wagons, and arrived at Boonesboro before midnight. Sedgewick's reconnaissance. The reconnaissance from Sedgwick's corps began before dawn on the morning of July 5, but instead of a division they took the entire corps. It struck the rear guard of Ewell's corps late in the afternoon at Granite Hill near Fairfield, but the result was little more than a skirmish, and the Confederates camped a mile and a half west of Fairfield, holding the position with only the picket line. Warren informed Meade that he and Sedgwick believed Lee was concentrating the main body of his army around Fairfield and preparing for battle. Meade immediately halted his army, and early on the morning of July 6, he ordered Sedgwick to resume his reconnaissance to determine Lee's intentions and the status of the mountain passes. Sedgwick argued with him about the risky nature of sending his entire corps into the rugged country and dense fog ahead of him, and by noon Meade abandoned his plan, resuming his original intention of advancing east of the mountains to Middletown, Maryland. The delays leaving Gettysburg and the conflicting orders to Sedgwick about whether to conduct merely a reconnaissance or a vigorous advance to engage Lee's army in combat would later cause Meade political difficulties, as his opponents charged him with indecision and timidity. Given the conflicting signals from Meade, Sedgwick and Warren followed the more conservative course. They waited to start until Ewell's corps had cleared out of Fairfield and remained at a safe distance behind it as it moved west. Lee assumed that Sedgwick would attack his rear and was ready for it. He told Ewell, "If these people keep coming on, turn back and thrash them." Ewell replied, "By the blessing of Providence I will do it," and ordered Marge. Gen. Robert E. Rhodes's division to form a battle line. The 6th Corps followed Lee only to the top of Monterey Pass, however, and did not pursue down the other side. Pursuit to Williamsport. Before Meade's infantry began to march in earnest in pursuit of Lee, Buford's cavalry division departed from Frederick to destroy Imboden's train before it could cross the Potomac. Hagerstown was a key point on the Confederate retreat route, and seizing it might block or delay their access to the fords across the river. On July 6, Kilpatrick's division, after its success raiding at Monterey Pass, moved toward Hagerstown and pushed out the two small brigades of Chambliss and Robertson. However, infantry commanded by Brig. Gen. Alfred Iverson drove Kilpatrick's men back through the streets of town. Stuart's remaining brigades came up and were reinforced by two brigades of Hood's division, and Hagerstown was recaptured by the Confederates. Buford heard Kilpatrick's artillery in the vicinity and requested support on his right. Kilpatrick chose to respond to Buford's request for assistance and joined the attack on Imboden at Williamsport. Stuart's men pressured Kilpatrick's rear and right flank from the position at Hagerstown, and Kilpatrick's men gave way and exposed Buford's rear to the attack. Buford gave up his effort when darkness fell. At 5 p.m. on July 7, Buford's men reached within a half-mile of the parked trains, but Imboden's command repulsed their advance. The Battle of Boonesboro occurred along the National Road on July 8. Stuart advanced from the direction of Funkstown and Williamsport with 5 brigades. He first encountered Union resistance at Beaver Creek Bridge, 4.5 miles north of Boonesboro. By 11 a.m., the Confederate cavalry had pushed forward to several mud-soaked fields, where fighting on horseback was nearly impossible, forcing Stuart's troopers and Kilpatrick's and Buford's divisions to fight dismounted. By mid-afternoon, the Union left under Kilpatrick crumbled as the Federals ran low on ammunition under increasing Confederate pressure. Stuart's advance ended about 7 p.m. a.m. However, when Union infantry arrived, and Stuart withdrew north to Funkstown, Stuart's strong presence at Funkstown threatened any Union advance toward Williamsport, posing a serious risk to the Federal right and rear if the Union Army moved west from Boonesboro. As Buford's division cautiously approached Funkstown via the National Road on July 10, it encountered Stuart's crescent-shaped, 3-mile-long battle line, initiating the Battle of Funkstown. Colonel Thomas C. Devon's dismounted Union Cavalry Brigade attacked about 8 a.m. By mid-afternoon, with Buford's cavalrymen running low on ammunition and gaining little ground. Col. Louis A. Grant's 1st Vermont Brigade of Infantry arrived and clashed with Brig. Gen. George T. Anderson's Confederate Brigade, the first time opposing infantry had fought since the Battle of Gettysburg. By early evening, Buford's command began withdrawing south towards Beaver Creek, where the Union Vi and 11th Corps had concentrated. Buford and Kilpatrick continued to hold their advance position around Boonesboro, awaiting the arrival of the Army of the Potomac. French's command sent troops to destroy the railroad bridge at Harper's Ferry and a brigade to occupy Maryland Heights, which prevented the Confederates from outflanking the lower end of South Mountain and threatening Frederick from the southwest. Face-off at the Potomac. Meade's infantry had been marching hard since the morning of July 7. Slocum's wing marched 29 miles on the first day from Littlestown, Pennsylvania, to Walkersville, Maryland. Parts of the 11th Corps covered distances estimated between 30 and 34 miles from Emmitsburg to Middletown. By July 9, most of the Army of the Potomac was concentrated in a 5-mile line from Rohrersville to Boonesboro. Other Union forces were in position to protect the outer flanks at Maryland Heights and at Waynesboro. Reaching these positions was difficult because of the torrential rains on July 7 that turned the roads to quagmires of mud. Long detours were required for the 3rd and 5th Corps, although the disadvantage of the additional distance was offset by the road's proximity to Frederick, which was connected by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad to Union supply centers, and by the superior condition of those roads, including the macadamized National Road. The Confederate Army's rear guard arrived in Hagerstown on the morning of July 7, screened skillfully by the cavalry, and began to establish defensive positions. By July 11 they occupied a 6-mile line on high ground, with the right resting on the Potomac River near Downsville and the left about 1.5 miles southwest of Hagerstown, covering the only road from there to Williamsport. The Conococheague Creek protected the position from any attack that might be launched from the west. They erected impressive earthworks with a 6-foot-wide parapet on top and frequent gun emplacements, creating comprehensive crossfire zones. Longstreet's Corps occupied the right end of the line, Hill's the center, and Ewell's the left. These works were completed on the morning of July 12, just as the Union Army arrived to confront them. Meade telegraphed to General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck on July 12 that he intended to attack the next day, unless something intervenes to prevent it. Quote, he once again called a council of war with his subordinates on the night of July 12. Of the 7 senior officers, only Brig. Gen. James S. Wadsworth and Marge. Gen. Olive Haro. Howard were in favor of attacking the Confederate fortifications. Objections centered on the lack of reconnaissance that had been performed. On July 13, Meade and Humphreys scouted the positions personally and issued orders to the Corps commanders for a reconnaissance in force on the morning of July 14. This one-day postponement was another instance of delay for which Meade's political enemies castigated him after the campaign. Halleck told Meade that it was proverbial that councils of war never fight.